It's weird because I was Democrat, or I don't never progressive, I guess, but I was left leaning, and I always believed in individual responsibility. I just didn't realize that made me a conservative, but it actually does. But I did learn in social work school that there were systems against me. I did learn about my white privilege. I did learn about, how being a woman, I was oppressed in America, in the 90s and 2000s. I don't believe those things anymore. And even if those things are true, they're not provable. But even if they are true, it's still not healthy to emphasize those things to people who are seeking counseling and trying to better their lives.
Pamela Garfield-Jaeger is a licensed clinical social worker who returned from a 5-year career hiatus to discover that her profession had been taken over by a bizarre new ideology. She is the author of 2 books: A Practical Response to Gender Distress, Tips and Tools for Families, and a new book for preschoolers, Froggy Girl. We discuss the capture of her profession by gender ideology and the God-shaped hole that gender identity fills. Pamela, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Pamela, for listeners who are not familiar with your story, can you briefly explain your Rip Van Winkle experience as a social worker that you talk about?
Sure. Yeah, I wrote an article called Rip Van Therapist. So that's how I describe myself. Because, as you said, I had this hiatus from a disability. And so that was 2016, 2017 through 2021. I actually I bounced back in briefly, tried to work, but then I had to drop right back out again because of severe pain that I was dealing with, and I had to get some surgeries. So I was dealing with all of that and not paying attention to the culture and how my profession had just completely turned radical, especially when it comes to this gender thing. So I came back in 2021. This is in California at a clinic where I actually was a group therapy leader for teens and adults. But they put me more with the teens because that's where my strength lies. And I think a lot of people don't like working with the teens, and I do. And with the teen program, 1 out of 3 kids were identifying as trans. They were all non-binary. That was popular at the time. And they were all girls. And all my colleagues were just going along with it, not just going along with it, affirming it. I hadn't even heard that word before, affirming. That wasn't a word that was used before I left for my disability. Now everyone hears that word and uses that word. So just so much had changed. We had gone through the BLM riots, and everyone had posted a black square, and there was a lot of racial justice discussion. All of that was brewing before, but it wasn't on the surface at the time. And so there were so many different ideas that were being pushed on these kids that really weren't developmentally, I'd say, ready to talk about all these things. And also, these were kids that were dealing with really severe mental health issues. These were kids that had been hospitalized for some kind of suicide attempt, or had some had some psychotic symptoms, severe paranoia, things like that. So they should have been focused on getting better, but yet the therapist and the culture at large was really pushing those things as opposed to their healing, their mental healing. So it's just bizarre to me, just seeing it all. And the victim mentality too was really profound. I actually hadn't seen that in the mental health world because, there's that narrative, you're a survivor, you're, strong, you can do it kind of thing. And then there was this switch where in the therapy world that you should embrace these diagnoses to the point where you use them to get away with things. And that was reinforced to the kids, something that, I thought we were supposed to teach kids not to do. and it was not helping them. So there was just so many different parts of my profession I was looking at that I just couldn't believe that I was seeing.
When you came through school and earned your certification, the profession knew the science of human development. The stages of the human life cycle were understood, and the child consequently did not lead their own treatment or therapy. Can you outline the areas of knowledge, the things known that the profession had to unlearn in order to embrace gender identity for kids?
Yeah, there's so many aspects of child development that have been completely thrown out the window. Of course, all the things that we went through in COVID, and masking people up and all that, it has been bizarre that my profession embraced it and didn't fight back against these things. There are these very long-standing theories that have been accepted within the psychology community, about the stages of development. There's a Piaget cognitive stages of development, which talks about how when children are young, they don't have, they don't understand, well, they don't understand like abstract thinking, and they start to learn abstract thinking in adolescence, but it's still a challenge depending on, how mature they are cognitively. And so when we're talking about gender, the that's very abstract. What does that even mean? I mean, no one can even answer that really, but there's certainly an abstract connection to that. And children, especially little children, if we're talking about these little kids that they're putting on puberty blockers, have very concrete thinking. Uh, there are these experiments where they show, very basic like characteristics like a dress or, a pants, and they'll just say that's a girl and that's a boy because that's how kids think. They think in a very concrete way. And we're teaching them, one, to think, to embrace those concrete thinking, and then that doesn't make sense in their future thinking if they concretely like to wear dresses or pants or like sports or trucks or all these gender stereotypes, that means they're a boy or a girl. I think your audience is familiar with that graph, like GI Joe versus Barbie. All right, where are you on the scale? I mean, it's unbelievable that they're using that for children that don't have the cognitive development to conceptualize those things. So that is one thing that's been very bizarre. And then the other major theory that's always been very embraced by psychology is the Erik Erikson stages of development, in particular the adolescent stage, which is about forming identity. And it's all about how your identity is not locked when you're a teenager. You're working that out. I think probably anybody who's an adult remembers being a teenager trying to figure out who they are, which friends they should hang out with, what style they should have, what kind of haircut they like, and it fluctuates. So to lock that in and say that means you have this gender identity that should be medicalized is profoundly bizarre that professionals are embracing that.
I have never seen an ideology that was this destructive of family bonds. Even the most affirming parents stand to lose their children to estrangement because Jeffrey Marsh is telling the child to go no contact anyway. So the intergenerational damage seems built in, particularly when you remember that most of these kids end up affecting their fertility. Um, what did your profession understand about the importance of the parental bond that your profession has forgotten here?
Yeah, this is the most profound aspect of this ideology, or the most, I don't know, it's just hard to wrap my head around how that switched so hard. I don't think I've ever mentioned this one, but I did a family therapy training in Berkeley, California in 2008. It was a year-long training. And of course, they very much embraced the family. None of this stuff was prevalent at the time. And, these were very liberal, left-leaning therapists, and I could never imagine those people who I interacted then would embrace this at that time. I have no idea what they're doing now. But that was the culture. My profession has always embraced the family so much, I think even to a fault at times, particularly when it comes to child welfare, and the foster care. I actually think this is one thing that's improved, that they've expedited the, adoption process for foster kids, because they used to work so hard to reunify families that were violent or dangerous. And there have been several cases where kids have died under those circumstances because the social workers wanted their kids to be reunited with these dangerous parents, or, really addicted parents that couldn't get clean, that sort of thing. So that's the social workers were so, I don't know, idealistic to a fault about the family, that some kids were harmed in the process. Now it's flipped on its head, that I'd say a regular decent parent that just believes in the truth is now looked at as an abuser. It's unbelievable. And of course, families are divided for so many aspects of this ideology. Like you said, they're being groomed by people online to not talk to their parents. They can't communicate because they learn this new, like, parallel language. And I think that's all by design. Um, and it's strange to me that these professionals, so-called professionals, can't see through any of that. It seems so obvious to me. It's super obvious to me. It was at the time when I came back from that hiatus. I just thought I was living in the twilight zone. But now that I've been in it, I just still can't believe they're not figuring that out. The people are parroting the same lines. It's not coming from them. It's coming from the internet, or, from other people. And yeah, the professionals have just completely lost their common sense when it comes to the family and the importance of the family. Um, Family therapy was always very emphasized. And even when you're not doing family therapy, I'd like people to understand that the parents should be involved in any kind of mental health. Even the quote unquote bad parents are supposed to be involved. They should be involved. And because we're usually not actually taking the kid out of the home. So if you think that parent is that abusive and you send that kid back to the parents, how are you doing your job if you're not supporting the parents and helping the communication bond between the parent and the child, or, whatever issues are happening there? Yeah, my profession has just completely lost the idea. It's called systems theory, and that was very embraced. That's something that I believe in, which is looking at the family as a system and not looking at someone just individually, right? Even when there is some kind of organic thing that is happening in the family, like someone has cancer per se, and you don't just treat the person with cancer and what's going on, you treat the whole family, because that's impacting everybody, if you're the counselor, right? So the trans thing, because they're so hell-bent on believing this is some inborn thing, some gendered brain, that you need to fix that, as opposed to looking at what are all the psychosocial dynamics there. And yeah, it's funny because therapists used to be, to a fault, analyzing everything, right? Everything is something else, as opposed to maybe something very basic, like the person might just be hungry or didn't get enough sleep or something. And they used to overanalyze everything. Now it's so face value. There's no analytics at all. There's no assessment. Even when they know that there's something else, an underlying issue, they just don't see it that way. It's just bizarre. The capture of it and the lack of common sense. I'm still trying to understand how they can believe these things.
All the books that I've read from non-affirming therapists say that the first key to getting through your child's gender crisis is authoritative parenting. Some people hear or read that phrase, they think of authoritarian parenting, which is not the same thing. To what extent do you think politics made this transformation of the social work and therapy professions possible? How much of it is about the hubris of people convinced that they can change the world for the better? We saw a lot of that in recent years.
Yeah, there's a very progressive worldview, that the children should lead, and parents should get out of their way. Um, I was just reflecting on it. We haven't heard that phrase in a while, but remember when everyone used to say adulting, that's difficult to adult, and making that a playful thing. But those people who were having trouble adulting are parents now, and they're not being adults to the children. And so I think that the culture and politics together have shifted the way people look at parenting. I mean, it probably goes back way further. I mean, I don't like talking about what's right or wrong for parenting. I don't, because I think that that's maybe part of the problem. All these quote unquote parenting experts, I think, have screwed a lot of us up. Um, Even, there's ones that I think are maybe more moderate that have reasonable things to say, but then I hear some of the things they say and I'm like, I don't know. And it's like reading a self-help book that could help somebody, but then maybe make it worse for someone else because they need the opposite advice. But our culture has really, I don't know, it is really embraced this idea that children are like almost like deities or something, that children know better. I mean, my psychological way of looking at it, I analyze it as it's a lot of wounded adults that didn't get their needs met, and they're trying to rework what happened to them when they were a child, and they're not doing what the current child that's in front of them needs. And I think that's leading a lot of the culture and the politics, as particularly the progressive politics. There's a lot of rescue fantasies out there. They want to rescue their younger self through children. So, and that's not helping. What's happening is now the kids are floundering because they need adults to lead them. They need adults to tell them what's up and what's down. And when truth becomes arbitrary, truth, my truth, your truth, whatever you say goes, then that becomes very disconcerting, especially to a young person who's trying to make sense of the world. And I likened it to like a glass of water that you've just spilled it all over the ground. They need a container, they need a cup, and the adults are supposed to be that cup for them. And you look at kids that if you give them some kind of rules and limits, they do better. If you say it's a free for all, you give them a menu from the Cheesecake Factory and tell them they can pick whatever they want, it's very overwhelming. If you give them a menu of 10 things or less, they're usually able to pick a lot easier. And I think that's what's happening for kids. And yeah, the politics and the culture are certainly influencing that way of interacting with children.
You have not shied away from the conservative label. Where were you politically a decade ago versus today? How has this issue affected your, let's call it, political evolution?
It's interesting. Exactly a decade ago in 2015, I very much embraced gender. It's very embarrassing to say now. To the point, it was the one little fight I had with my husband. I came home from this training, this indoctrinating training that I see it now as. At the time, I didn't. Um, it was early on in California that I was trained to, be so accepting of gender, all these different genders and trans people. I met some trans people. They spoke in this training. And I learned a lot of the things that most people hadn't heard yet at that point. So I was kind of a little bit ahead of the curve. I'm sure there are lots of people even ahead of it before then, but the main population wasn't thinking about it and didn't know a lot of these terms like two-spirit and things like that. I had already learned those things. And I mean, I wasn't walking around barking at anybody about what they should and shouldn't do like people are today, but I certainly thought that they were something to accept. And that's certainly not how I feel now. I can see right through it now. Politically in general, I was a lifelong Democrat until 2020. The thing that opened my eyes was the all the racial tensions, all the riots of 2020, the George Floyd death and the reaction, and how everyone was in lockstep, and how you couldn't say anything, you couldn't deviate and just ask questions and say like, why does this one incident mean the entire country is racist? And then I looked at the stats of the police shootings and saw that it was like less than 10 people had been shot. 10 black people had been 10 unarmed black people had been shot that year, things like that. So it just opened my eyes up to everything. And then I started to read some Thomas Sowell. And if anybody out there hasn't read any Thomas Sowell and you're curious and you still think that conservatives are stupid or fuddy-duddy or racist or any of those labels, um, I recommend you read a little bit of Thomas Sowell. He showed me that a lot of the things that I thought were helping people were actually making it worse. As a social worker, that was quite difficult to embrace that a lot of things that I believed in were harming people. A lot of things that I was voting for were harming people. That there are costs to policies that feel good, that feel like they're helping, and that it really has led to where we are today. I think a lot of people in your audience probably see the problems with a lot of these ideas now. Um, but even in the past, those things were planting the seeds for today. So yeah, fast forward to now, well, I did vote for Trump, and I did not vote for Trump in 2016. Although I was never a hater, I just thought he was an idiot. I thought he was a silly reality TV star that had a big head. Well, I guess he still has a big head, but I can see the good that he has done. And of course, I have no idolization of any politician. I don't consider myself a Trumper, but I'm certainly glad that the Democrats are not in power. I'm definitely glad that Kamala Harris is not in power. I recognize how we were headed to communism and really a lot of authoritarianism. I never felt the thumb of the government like I felt in California during the lockdowns, like I felt then. Part of why I'm so outspoken is because I had this disability. I couldn't work a normal job, and then they fired me for declining the COVID vaccine. That was the most the federal government has ever affected my life directly. That was the first time I realized how the Second Amendment is actually important. I never understood that before. Because, I lived as a free, very spoiled, free American. When you have your freedoms, you don't realize how precious they are. And I learned that. And I realized that those things are important. And then all of a sudden, I became patriotic and I realized how important it was, these people that fought for my freedom. And I had gratitude that I never had before. I kind of was that spoiled American that didn't realize it. So I no longer feel that way. And, grateful for my freedom of speech. And I didn't realize that the Democrats were stifling freedom of speech, when all the social media platforms were stifling freedom of speech and, canceling people on Twitter for saying that there are only two genders or that, a man is a man and a woman is a woman or something very basic like that. I've never recognized that type of authoritarianism. And when I talk to other people who still, just aren't awake to those things, they don't realize it's happening. But I do. And so I embrace the word conservative because I do want to conserve my freedom. I want to conserve what has made my life good and so many others prosperous. And I also look at people who were immigrants that came to America for freedom and they don't take it for granted. A lot of, I'd say, white progressives, they look at people like Cubans, for example, and they'll say that they're ignorant or they're not educated and otherwise they'd vote differently. No, I think they actually know better. They know more than me. They've lived it. And so I like to look at people who've lived through these experiences and learn from them. And so yeah, I've really gone through a shift. And this whole gender thing, I think, is the most egregious. It's the most obvious for people who are noticing how how authoritarian the progressives are. They're not progressive, they're regressive. So I'm okay with saying I'm a conservative. In fact, if someone saw me as progressive, I'd be embarrassed at this point. And in the past, I wouldn't have said that.
You have, in fact, argued that your profession needs more conservatives. Can you lay out that argument for listeners?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I was not conservative, but maybe I was this whole time and didn't know it. But it has gone off the rails, and that is a lot of why I became public. Because even people I'd say who would identify themselves or believe themselves as progressive would not recognize how radical the mental health profession has become, in particular, social workers. Social workers are the extreme. Um, and so if they had somebody to balance them out, to be able to speak up, of course, in academia and these circles, The conservatives, I believe, they probably were there, but they were either silenced or pushed out, both. And so their voices became muted, and all we got were the radical leftists in the profession. And I think they could have helped balance things out. I mean, I honestly still think I'm, I'm still trying to figure it out, but I think that there is merit to some progressive ideas, or I don't know if the ideas, but the temperament, I'd say, the caretaking temperament and all of that, um, which gets exploited and hijacked by these, I'd say, people who are pushing these negative agendas. Um, but by nature, therapists are very naive. They're very they want to help. They're nice. They don't confront. They're usually conflict adverse. And so people who are conservative, their personalities are, they're usually a little more able to like push back. And the profession is missing that. And I've been pushed out. In fact, I was just kicked off Facebook completely. And so that's where I was still communicating with some progressive therapists. I think it was by design that I was somebody that didn't trust the government. I didn't trust authority, that I was pushed out of my job. A lot of therapists in general are people that are cooperative. I'd say I was a good little girl for most of my life. I guess that's changed now. But I think we need more people that are willing to speak up, that will push back, that recognize that individual freedoms and freedom of choice, medical freedom is what I'm referring to, um, and question authority, question institutions, and don't bow to academia and its ideas. I think we need more people like that. I mean, there's so many aspects to it. And also just, I mean, it's weird because I was Democrat, or I don't know, never progressive, I guess, but I was left leaning, and I always believed in individual responsibility. I just didn't realize that made me a conservative, but it actually does. But I did learn in social work school that there were systems against me. I did learn about my white privilege. I did learn about, how being a woman, I was oppressed in America, in the 90s and 2000s. I don't believe those things anymore. And even if those things are true, they're not provable, but even if they are true, it's still not healthy to emphasize those things to people who are seeking counseling and trying to better their lives. I mean, why would we emphasize to someone that they're a victim and nothing is in their control and then expect them to get better? That's just, I say, counterintuitive to anything that would go along with therapy and self-actualization and all of those things that we need to get better, even in the toughest of times. I was even just talking or commenting on Christina Buttons just did a post about how she embraces the more conservative perspective of mental health because of the aspect of personal responsibility. And she said, except for a few cases with severe mental illness, it's people have responsibility. And I was like, even or they have agency, if you're really saying. I mean, not everything is obviously someone's individual responsibility, but they still have agency and they can still make choices, even in even with tough things. And they usually will need help. It's not like they can do it on their own. Because people got kind of mad at me, like, oh, well, they just can grit it out. No, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about gritting it out. Sometimes you should, but there's certainly cases that, as someone who's been a therapists working with the most severe populations, including lockdown facilities for people who need to be restrained for their own safety. I have seen it. I know that people need help. And so when people hear that I'm conservative, they think it means I'm cold, or it means that I think that people shouldn't get help. That's not it at all. And I do interact with a lot of other conservative therapists that are very much like me. They know people need help, but it's the type of help that we believe would actually empower them and help them. And then, of course, we're going to get into it next, but the religious aspect of it, um, most progressive therapists exclude religion, or they even downplay it, or negative towards it. And I've seen so many people get better with religion. I've worked with I was doing home visits in the projects in the Bronx, and a lot of my clients there, they wanted to pray with me. And I personally didn't, I wasn't aligned with their religion, my personally, but I thought it was a really good strength. And I was taught that in my previous training to embrace people's culture and their strength and not push ideas on them. The other population that's really neglected, especially by progressive therapists, are men, especially white men. They're told their masculinity is toxic. And a lot of this ties right into the gender stuff. A lot of these boys are told they're horrible by their own therapist. And so how can we say that that's helpful? And so all of these therapists they go along with these ideas that, we have to be accepting, we have to be so accepting that we'll let people cut body parts off and not question it, or write letters for them and push them to get their body parts cut off. That's not progressive. So yeah, I think conservative therapists, their voices are needed and they could help balance things out quite a bit.
Let's talk about that God-shaped hole that gender seems to fill. Um, in fact, let's talk about your new book. You use the G word in Froggy
Yeah.
Girl. It's not sectarian. Your book doesn't say, "Hey, child, go to church and recite the creed." God is giving epistemic value to self-acceptance.
Hmm.
Saying God made you this way tells the child that their sexed body being male or female, or in your story being human rather than a frog, is beyond their control. It's beyond the family's control. It's beyond the community's ability to change. It's beyond the power of prayer. You have to accept yourself the way you are. That was my take.
Yeah.
My sense is that children need God more than adults do, that gender really takes advantage of that phase in human development, or actually phases. There are multiple phases of human development where magical thinking is normal, but it's strongest in children. What is your take on the quasi-religious or cult-like nature of trans, and what hole do you think it is filling in these kids?
Yeah, I used to think it was quasi-religious. I know people don't like to say it is religious for the legal implications of that, but it is religious. I didn't realize how religious trans was until I read James Lindsay and Logan Lansing's book, The Queering of the American Child. I don't know if you've read that one, but he had me review that, and it is religious. And if you look more at even social media posts, like Jamie Reed posted when she was at a hearing that they were doing prayer circles when she was there for the trans kids. And trans kids are kind of become these sacred lambs. And there's a lot of posts like that where you even see Jeffrey Marsh has a post about being a god, that they're worshipped as gods. I don't know if they really believe they're gods, but that's what they say. Also, they've also said in the writings that I read this in the queering book, that when you become trans, it's like a resurrection, just like Easter. It's really wild when you learn more, when you read more about their writings and what's behind their philosophy and their ideology. So it's very religious, and so it certainly has filled a hole in people's, I'd say, a spiritual hole. And we can really get into the philosophy of that, but I think that that has certainly filled a void for people, especially those that it attracts, the ideology attracts, because it's usually people who are lost in some way, or struggling socially in some way, maybe have some kind of trauma, or disenfranchised from their peers or their family, or, has some kind of, issue difficulties in their families, or are very much already divided from their parents, and then this just reinforces it. So that's how they're recruited, just like, they would be for a cult. And cults are very religious too. So I did mention God in the book, and I'll fully disclose I'm personally not even that religious. However, I do recognize the importance of religion, of a healthy religion on people. And at the very least, I wrote that, and it's not really forcing people or children or families to believe in anything, but it's really just it's put out there as something to chew on, to think about, and kind of the way you described it is it's sort of a way to show that this is something that you just are. It's about a little girl who wishes she was a frog and she realized she's a little girl, and that's how God made her. So I put that there. And I think it's important for people, at the very least. I strongly believe religion shouldn't be pushed on anyone, and any kind of religion shouldn't be pushed. But I certainly think it should be introduced to people, and they should think about it, and they should learn what works for them in a healthy manner. Because I think religion is very helpful for individuals and for our culture as a whole. Even if it's some you don't not sure what you believe in God, I think religion also serves a lot of purposes. It forms community. It forms healthy like good morals. You know, the Ten Commandments. You know, we're talking the Judeo-Christian values. They're actually they have worked for a reason. And you know, the pride festivals and queering and all that, they're trying to eradicate that. And that is what our country is based on. And I'm not talking about religion per se, but the values behind it. Our country is based on that. And I think that the queering and the trans world is trying to eradicate those values. And they're obviously attacking the kids very young. So I think that's why I put that in the book for children to have that. And maybe for the parent to open up a conversation about what they believe in, you know, what God they believe in and what their religion in their home is, so that they can talk about that. So that's why that's there.
I enjoyed seeing you use the word Gnostic to
Hmm.
describe the phenomenon. I would add the word Hermeticism to this vocabulary of magical thinking. I've argued that those two things, Gnosticism and Hermeticism, they are to esoteric religion what the binary and ternary forms are to music. In other words, they just sort of repeat throughout history. What's interesting is that they were both heretical influences that the early Christian church had to disown. And in my own study and writing of New Age UFO religions, it is striking how every cult religious figure goes back to these two patterns of magical thinking.
Mhm.
And then there are the academics. You know, you have Hegel. Was the political philosopher, and he was a Hermeticist. And you have all the political religions of the modern world that display this sort of Gnostic behaviors. Why did you use that particular word? What is it about the word Gnostic that you picked up on?
Yeah, I mean, it really is this collection of beliefs that are religious that have no proof. You know, how do we know anyone is born in the wrong body? It's one of those things that you just don't, if you believe it, you tend not to question it. And I'll even include myself there. In the past, I did believe there were some people that were born in the wrong body, or I at least entertained the idea. And when I thought more about it, I was like, where does that even come from? It doesn't even make any sense. And we have no proof of that. And so, you know, that's where the idea came from. But the word, honestly, I was influenced by a detransitioner who I'm not going to name her, but I knew her while she was still trans, and I've befriended her while she was trans. I think she was sort of starting to think about detransition, or, you know, she was starting that deprogramming process. And I befriended her, and we were in touch for several years while she was detransitioning. And she used that word, and it really stuck with me. And so I think so I give her the credit. And she couldn't think of any other word for what she used to believe in, you know, what she used to align with. And so that's where it came. That's how I was influenced, was this detransitioner who detransitioned before my eyes over a course of like 2 years. I like watching her deprogram she's not the only one I've now seen where I was friends with them while they were trans, or, you know, they kind of befriended me because they were like, thanks for talking about how crazy it all is, but, you know, I'm trans, so it's, you know, I'm like the exception. And then fast forward a couple of years, and the quote unquote true trans person is now detransitioned. And I know a handful, I have like three or four people where I've experienced that. And people will say, "Do you know a trans person?" I'm like, "Yeah, I did. I knew them. And now they're detransitioner, but I knew them before." So that's where that word came from for me, and that's a lot of the learning that a lot of my perspectives have come from is meeting people who were trans and s- observing them detransition and hearing them express themselves both to me one-on-one and just in private conversations and then also publicly while they're figuring things out is where I've learned a lot about just how much this stuff just doesn't make sense and how much we've all been programmed.
Now that we've had this conversation, let's talk about the academy for a minute. What happened to the people who make the social workers? Do you think that perhaps they fell into a belief system or thought of themselves as sort of a substitute savior? Is it a savior complex, do you think? Is that what happened?
Yes, I do. I definitely think it's a savior complex. I think that it takes one to know one. I think the people that gravitate towards social work profession have a savior complex to a degree. We want to help, right? Um, and we're also naive. And but then there are evil people, and I think most social workers are not evil. Even the ones that really push this stuff, I don't believe are evil. I think they've been fooled. I think they've been recruited. Um, but how did it get this far? It still baffles me, honestly. And I didn't recognize how badly it had progressed until I came back from that hiatus I mentioned earlier. So it was more clear for me. And yeah, because I was just going about my business. Even before things had been progressing, even in, I think 2015 was when things got really bad. But quite frankly, these ideas have been brewing for much longer than that. It's just I was not a gender therapist. I was not really exposed to most of these gender ideas. And I looked at it as something that was just sort of like very rare and, not something that I would encounter very much. But it is bizarre to see how much the profession has been captured. Um, I the lockdowns and people now spending so much time via Zoom and not being able to have face-to-face conversations about these ideas, I think has progressed it also. Um, if you look at the social media so there's National Association of Social Workers or NASW, they are super radical and they have scaled back now, I think, since Trump's in power because they're a little afraid and I think they're trying to protect their funding, perhaps. But they've been so bold and radical about pushing all kinds of things, all vaccines on babies, and obviously the gender thing is really the most radical for little kids. They're not shy about saying it. I remember just a few years ago that was supposedly not happening, and then it was boldly being promoted in the most prominent institutions for mental health. So, what happened? I honestly, I wish I really understood. I did read Helen Joyce's book, and she spoke a lot about the captures of institution and the funding. I think a lot the activist groups have taken over. The money speaks, right? And I think there's a lot of like blood money behind the scenes. But I haven't done the direct investigating to know. I think that they get a lot of money for promoting these things. Uh, Basically, the social workers are an arm for the Democrats, and they had a post about rallying against Trump and everything. And meanwhile, I know many social workers who did vote for Trump, but they're silenced and they're pushed out. It is profoundly bad. I wish I really understood how bad it is. I'll tell another vignette. It's not social work, but the marriage and family therapists. They're the other big group of therapists. I actually did some trainings with them, but I'm going to talk about there's a student, and she's even in a Catholic university. I tweeted about this. She's been messaging me that they forced her to watch BDSM in her clinical therapy class. They also forced her to write an essay about her sexual blossoming and and masturbation. And she's complained about it and she's gone nowhere with it. Luckily, I've actually been able to connect her with some organizations that are going to help her legally. But that's how radical it is, and that's normal. So there, and she showed the images, the they're bad. There, if you look at my Twitter at True Therapist, you can find some of those images. It's unbelievable. Even if you believe that, I mean, that's a whole other podcast, that porn is okay to a degree, which I don't anymore. Or if you believe that this stuff is okay, or maybe you want to learn about it so you can help your clients, deal with it. But that's not the context that they're teaching this stuff. They're teaching it is to normalize it. And they're really trying to upend society. And as most people, I think most of your listeners know, is that this porn and this violent sexual images is what's turning children off to growing up as men or women. That's what's making them scared of becoming, especially the girls, becoming girls. But the boys also very much become afraid of their own sexuality. They're told they're toxic and then they're become addicted to this terrible porn and they think that's what they're going to become. And so the therapists are they're being taught this as opposed to being taught to help them with it. They're being taught to push it. The one training I went to, I was taught about, how to just decompress after basically a gangbang, and that's okay. And not and the ironically, the training was about sexual trauma, and it wasn't to help the person maybe recognize some choices that are, reinforcing this trauma. It was just about building coping skills for, all these deviant sexual acts. And that's what especially those sex therapists are being taught. They're not being taught like healthy things, or at least to explore what might be healthy for that individual, because of course there is a range. But yeah, I think therapists are now becoming, especially social workers, where I thought I joined a field that was there to help society. I really feel like we are being trained to upend society. And maybe that's been the case the whole time. I'm not sure. It certainly was never this extreme.
These organizations, they were not always political, right?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, things changed over time, especially in the last few years, because we had Donald Trump there as the sort of all-consuming reason for everything, right?
Yes.
He was the bad orange man, and that justified whatever. What do you think about, it's such a loose term, gender critical. It is just the universe of people who believe that women exist, basically. What do you think about GC world as a society, so to speak?
Mhm. I mean, that's broad because I mean, the way you just defined it is really most people, I think. It's definitely the majority. And not all of them are active in the discourse. Not all of them are, I'd say the Twitter gender critical world, or X now, is not always so healthy. Um, the detransitioners, I'm friends with a lot of them, but I know that they have their struggles, and they're in their social infights and such. That's human nature. But I think what has made it difficult for all of us, and I'd say myself included here, is we're all so passionate about this subject that sometimes that passion can get in the way and blind us a little bit to being like human and calming down a little bit and having some perspective. I think we could all use a break sometimes, more of a break than we take, because we're so passionate about this and we see the world being destroyed by it. And then, of course, so many people have had their personal lives destroyed by it, their own physical bodies, their children that they love dearly, their families split up and destroyed. So we're a ragged bunch of people. I'd say the only thing that makes me different is I am lucky enough that it did not impact me personally, aside from just the cultural aspects, but it didn't affect my family life or, my child, or, I didn't take hormones and, harm my health. So I think that's why maybe I'm able to have a more balanced perspective on it. But when you got people that have had so much pain because of this and have been silenced for so long, right? And are told they're crazy, have been ostracized from everyone in their life, their people they love, people in their families, have lost jobs. That's enough to drive anybody a little, I'll say, I don't want to use the word crazy, but metaphorically crazy. It's enough to make someone have challenges. And so you've got a whole group of us that have been silenced and canceled and have so much grief and loss and physical and emotional pain. So, that's going to show up in our group dynamics. And then you've got social media that amplifies all that, which doesn't help. But I also want to say that we're also the coolest people because I was actually just messaging someone who I was trying a producer of a show. I don't want to say yet because I'm not on it yet, but they were asking me about a couple of the prominent detransitioners, and I was telling them about how what a cool thing it is, the connections that we've made. There's a core group of us that have I think most of us met in Anaheim in California, and I think that was 2022. Most of us met in person then, and there's been this like cohort of us that have seen each other over the years and watching people grow, especially the young people like Chloe Cole, watching her develop. Um, and then there's just this like really neat bond that I think we'll all always have. Whether or not we'll all talk to each other forever, I'm not sure, but there's this bond that we have and this connection and really amazing friendships that have been built, and the bravery and the pushback that people have endured is really impressive. So I'm really grateful and proud to be part of that group too.
Pamela, where can listeners find you?
Let's see. I'm on X. I'm known as the Truthful Therapist for those that don't know. And so you can pretty much Google the Truthful Therapist, I think, and find me. But on X, I'm at Truth Therapist. On Instagram, which is where I kind of began because I enjoyed making funny videos. That was the way I coped with the madness. And I that is at the dot truthful therapist. I have a website that needs a little updating now, but it is www.thetruthfultherapist.org. My Froggy Girl book has its own website, which is www.froggygirlbook.com. I have a Substack, which is Pam the Truthful Therapist. I'm on YouTube, which is really just it's not a active channel. It's just where I dump a lot of videos that I've done in the past, and that is the Truthful Therapist at the Truthful Therapist. So those are some places to find me.
Pamela Garfield-Jaeger, thank you so much for joining me today.
You are welcome.
You have listened to a podcast production of thedistancemag.com, an encampment for the politically homeless. We examine gender identity issues through a critical and historical lens. Consider supporting thedistancemag.com with your paid premium subscription to receive instant early access to all content.